Hello, my name is Louise Hurel. I'm an international relations student at the Institute of International Relations of PUC-Rio and a research intern of the project Brasil Global. Today I'm here with Professor Amitav Acharya from the American University, USA. Welcome, Professor. It's a great pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. My first question would be that, do you believe that a security community is actually emerging in Asia? And related to that, can we infer that the Pacific emergence of China goes beyond mere rhetoric?
On your first question, if there is a security community emerging in Asia, the answer is no. However, as I will say in a moment, there are conditions for that community that we can see emerging, and maybe in the long term we might have a security community. But really, to answer your question, we need to know what is a security community. And if you mean by a security community a group of states where war has become say unthinkable, that nobody thinks of war to solve their problems, I don't think Asia is in that stage or will be in that stage for some time. That's partly because there are still a number of very serious conflicts in Asia, particularly between China and Japan, and also between China and its Southeast Asian neighbors over the South China Sea dispute, and also between China and India. So these disputes and conflicts have a potential to create actual war, and until these are resolved, we cannot have a security community. But on the positive side, the conditions that lead to a security community, for example in Europe, we can see them emerging in Asia. For example, economic interdependence. Now, Asia now has more than half of the trade of Asian countries are with each other, intra-regional trade. So economic integration is happening, if not by a single European Union style institution, but is driven by market forces, trade, investment, and finance. Those kind of interdependence is growing. That makes war costly, if not unlikely. Another condition is institutions, regional institutions. Now, 20-30 years ago, Asia had only about one real regional institution called ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and that was only in Southeast Asia. Today, we have close to more than half a dozen regional institutions. So we have ASEAN Regional Forum, which is a security institution, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, which is an economic trade institution. We have the East Asia Summit. It's a summit level meeting of leaders of Asia, but also the United States and Russia. And we have any number of smaller sub-regional groupings like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation. So Asia is much more institutionalized today than like in 1990 when the Cold War ended. And that was a good sign, because these institutions can lead to a larger community, as they did in Europe. Another sign I think it's very important is that Asian countries are increasingly democratic. Now, they're not all democratic. China, Vietnam are still under authoritarian communist rule, but all the other major powers of Asia are democratic. And so Japan, India, Indonesia, South Korea, they're all democratic. And what it means is that in a way that it's not like democratic peace theory applying to Asia, but it does reduce tensions among the democratic states. For example, to give you one very good example is Indonesia. Indonesia, since it became democratic, has actually strengthened its ties with its neighbors. It has rebuilt ASEAN as actually a security community, and that's really a very positive development. Unlike some critics who say democracies are newly emerging democracies actually tend to go to war against the neighbors, we don't see in Asia any evidence that a country after becoming democratic actually starts a fight with its neighbor. So these are the positive signs: economic interdependence, regional institutions, democracy. These are leading to more cooperation in Asia, even though not a community. And let me tell you one last thing. There is, of course, a military balancing in Asia between China and the US, China and Japan. But I don't see this as a containment strategy like the way the US dealt with the Soviet Union in the Cold War. What the Americans are doing is a kind of a more defensive balancing. They're hedging against China becoming expansionist, but they're not containing China. And that is also a very good sign. That means there is a balancing of power, but not containment. Balancing without containment, which means China is not provoked to the extent that it becomes more belligerent and becomes that containment or a balancing, like a self-fulfilling prophecy and leading towards the containment. So to answer this question in one sentence, I think Asia is not a security community, but the conditions that could lead to a security community in the future are emerging.
You talked about democracy. You talked about how that may contribute. But also, do you see that China itself could represent somehow not a conflict, but one obstacle for that integration, like China or Vietnam that you mentioned, that are not fit in this democratic sense?
Yeah.
Could that represent a real issue for this regional integration, for this, as you may call it, security community?
The first thing to keep in mind is that in Asia, regional institutions do not require democracy as a condition of membership. This is very different from the European Union, where all the members must be democratic to be able to join the EU. And if they are they have a coup or they deviate from democracy, they are suspended or sanctioned. In Asia, democracy is not a condition for joining any regional organization. So, because Asia has a whole variety of regimes, from military dictatorship to absolute monarchy to kind of communism, communist rule, and democracy. So that means China is not paranoid or worried about democracy, and therefore it feels more comfortable in joining Asian institutions, and it's been doing that since at least the 1990s. Secondly, if democracy, if China becomes democratic, if that happens, and it's not totally unlikely, then I think the chances of Asia becoming a security community will be greater, because that will remove at least a source of mistrust between China and the United States, and China and Japan, and China and Korea. I am not saying that's going to happen so easily, but China is liberalizing. It's not becoming democratic, but it's a more open space today than it was, say, during the Mao regime. So my answer then is that democracy is good for regional stability. It doesn't necessarily scare China away from regional institutions, because Asian regional institutions accept political and ideological diversity, which I think is one of their strengths.
Are there any differences between the way that China and the United States currently relates to formal multilateral institutions?
Yes, there are differences. First, to put it very simply, China prefers dialogue. America prefers action. Now, what it means is that for China, regional multilateral institutions should build confidence, build trust, and they should be forums for dialogue, but to not solve problems like settle disputes or mediate in interstate disputes. China prefers that any dispute settlement or conflict resolution should be done bilaterally, not multilaterally. For the United States, regional institutions should be action-oriented. They should actually do things like preventive diplomacy, conflict resolution. They should take on hard issues like the Korean Peninsula, like the South China Sea, not only discuss them, but try to find solutions to them. So there's a huge philosophical difference and difference in approach between China and the United States. However, having said that, there is also a common ground. Both US and China support multilateralism. There was a time when the Chinese were very skeptical of multilateralism. especially in the early 1990s. They thought it's bad for them because multilateralism allows small countries like the ASEAN countries to gang up against Chinese interest, and or multilateralism could become a tool in the hands of the United States to put pressure on China. So there were all kinds of fears in the Chinese mind, but they have overcome that, and they're very actively engaged in multilateral institutions. And the United States has done the same thing in a strange way. The United States was also skeptical of multilateralism in the 1990s, because traditionally the US has used its bilateral alliances, for example, with Japan, with South Korea, Philippines, Thailand. For the US, the bilateral alliances are historically the basis of its security engagement in the region. And the United States actually opposed multilateralism in the early 1990s. But just like China, but a little later than China, the US has come around, and now it's a very active player. It joined the East Asia Summit in 2011. It signed ASEAN's foundational treaty of amity and cooperation in 2009. So United States now does both bilateralism and multilateralism, but the change is that it's more engaged in multilateralism. So when you have the two biggest powers in the region, both embracing multilateralism and moving away from a purely bilateral approach, I think that's a very positive sign. They do both share the view that the architecture of the region has to have a strong multilateral component, despite the differences between them.
But what would you say that was one of the most important elements for example, for China to overcome and to approach this multilateral side that, as you said, contributes a lot for integration?
What are the most important obstacles? I think in one word it will be this sovereignty. China is a very sovereignty conscious country, partly because of its historical experience. China feels still that it has been humiliated by Western powers for too long, and is now re-emerging as a great power. And anything like even multilateral institutions can, especially if they become like the European Union kind of institution, supranational, it will undermine its sovereignty, and it will undermine its freedom of action in resolving or defending its territorial interests. And China has a lot of territorial disputes, especially in the maritime sphere with its neighbors. So that mindset has to be overcome. And the other thing China has to overcome, it's not going to be easy. China feels, at least the current Chinese leadership feels, that the United States is deliberately undermining China's territorial interests by supporting ASEAN in the South China Sea conflict, by supporting Japan in the East China Sea conflict. So China sees this as kind of a deliberate attempt by the Americans to undermine China's rise and China's interest. So this feeling, suspicion, also has to be managed, and the way to do that will be through dialogue and confidence building. And I think the regional institutions are trying to do that. This is also happening at the bilateral level, but it's going to take some time.
The last question that I have for you is, given the fact that China now seems to prefer informal regional institutions, in the eventuality of a Chinese hegemony, how would that affect global multilateral institutions?
Well, that's a very hypothetical question, because I'm not sure there will ever be a global hegemony by China to the extent that China can reshape or dominate global institutions on its own term. That's not to say that these institutions at the global level will not change. They will change, whether it's the UN or IMF, WTO, or World Bank. All these institutions are under pressure to reform, to democratize, to accept a greater voice by the rising powers, including Brazil. That's going to happen, but it's not going to be done by China alone. If those reforms are to happen, it has to be done by consensus, including the active encouragement or participation by the United States and the European powers. So it's not really up to China to reshape anything at the global level. At the regional level, I think China has the opportunity to put its own stamp on regional institutions, but it's also finding it very difficult. For example, when it comes to a group, small sub-regional group like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is a regional, it's a group between China, the Russians, and the Central Asian countries. That China can dominate. But even then, China is in a fight with Russia over that. But when China tries to influence ASEAN or ASEAN Regional Forum or East Asia Summit, it's not going to go very far. In fact, there is now a situation where the Chinese want to use the East Asia regional framework, especially something called the ASEAN Plus 3, as the main vehicle for promoting regionalism in Asia. But when the Chinese try to exclude Australia, New Zealand, and India from the East Asian Summit, to keep it really East Asian, because Australia, New Zealand, and India are not East Asian countries. When they tried to do that in 2004-05, they were unsuccessful. So the Australians, the New Zealanders, the Indians, and now the United States and the Russians all got in, despite the fact that China was not comfortable widening the East Asia Summit. So that tells you that China cannot single-handedly shape the membership or the agenda of regional institutions. And in Asia, we have this very interesting situation where the leadership of the driver's role of regional institutions doesn't belong to any great power. It belongs to a coalition of weak states, which is ASEAN. So neither China, nor United States, nor Japan, nor India are driving or leading regional cooperation or institutional building. It's ASEAN which is doing that. And this is very unique, because in most cases in history, it's the big powers that actually organize regional cooperation, like the concert of Europe in the 19th century. Even the European Union in many ways is driven by the big countries, Germany and France. In ASEAN or Asia, it's the other way around. And that actually constrains China's ability. It's become almost like a norm that great powers do not lead. It's the weak powers that lead the great powers. And every single great power who is a member of the ASEAN Regional Forum or Asian institutions accepts the principle of what is called ASEAN centrality. That ASEAN is central to regional architecture. So in that case, Asia is not going to be like the concept of power model, and that limits the ability of China to reshape even regional institutions. If it cannot shape regional institutions in its own light, then how can it do that to global institutions? Global institutions have even other powers, like India, Japan, Brazil, even if the United States loses its influence. But it's not like the rest of the powers, including the rising powers or emerging powers, are going to let China dictate the terms of these institutions. And I think the Chinese know that, so they will certainly want to increase their influence. But I don't think China will dominate these institutions like the United States had done after Second World War, when the United States basically created IMF, World Bank, and other institutions, and has been dominating them ever since. I don't think China will be in a position like that.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor, for taking your time to be over here, sharing these great answers. Thank you so much for your participation.
Thank you very much.
I hope you enjoyed it. I enjoyed it as well.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.